Hi, and welcome to our My Life on the Road lecture, a memoir by Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem is a lecturer, writer, political activist, and feminist organizer who has created or co-founded Miss Magazine and has been an editor of that publication for over 15 years. She also helped to found New York Magazine and has also been published in impressive works like Esquire and New York Times Magazine. She has won various literary awards, and her causes include gender roles and child abuse as roots of violence, nonviolent conflict resolution, and the cultures of Indigenous people. Gloria's early life could be considered somewhat chaotic. She was born on March 15th in 1934 in Toledo, Ohio, to Ruth and Leo Steinem. Her paternal grandmother was a huge source of feminist inspiration, being the chairwoman of the Educational Committee of National Women's Suffrage, and she graduated from Smith College, and after college spent 2 years in India. On the left, she is pictured with her mother, Ruth. Besides moving around a lot as a child, Gloria Steinem's mother had a very heavy influence in how chaotic her early childhood life was. At 34, before Gloria was born, Ruth suffered a nervous breakdown, which left her trapped in delusions that could often turn violent. Because of this disease in 1944, her parents divorced. She never blamed her father for leaving, but did feel his absence. Steinem blamed her mother not being able to hold a job and the apathy of her doctors toward her mother because she felt that they were anti-woman feelings and not anti her mother. On our right, we have a quick interview with Oprah asking about how her mother's illness and how people treated it affected how she would later approach her work in the feminist movement.
Have you thought about really how your mother's struggles influenced your work in the feminist struggle?
Yeah, that also took me a while. I think we spend a lot of time saying, I'm not going to be anything like my mother, before we realize that it's not an individual fault, it's a collective fate.
Ooh.
And so I, too, went through that period of time. But I do realize, looking back, that, I mean, my mother was a pioneer journalist before I was born. I didn't even know that until much later. She gave up everything, not because my father forced her to, but that was the way the world ran. She had what was then called a nervous breakdown, but I mean, she was really institutionalized for a couple of years, and then just to survive, became her goal. And she was, wonderful, smart, loving person. But I began to realize that actually I was living out her unlived life. And I think a lot of women, hopefully that will pass because women will be able to live out their own lives. But it's still true, I think, for a lot of us. And it made me understand that my mother had no journey of her own. My father had no home of his own. And we all need both.
We all need both. I appreciated that your mother once told you that if she had left your father, you would have never been born. And I read that you never found the courage to say to her what you really wanted to say to her about
Yeah,
that.
no, that's true. I mean, because I would, of course, be saying to her, because she had told me that she fell in love with someone else in the newspaper office, and she wanted to go to New York, and I was saying, but why didn't you marry this other guy? Go to New York with your girlfriend,
Yeah.
And then she would say, but then you
I
never would have been
been born.
born. And I so wanted to say to her, but then you would have been born. But I couldn't say it because it couldn't happen. If there had been a chance of it happening still,
You
I
would
would
have
have
said
said
it.
it.
To have said it would just seem cruel to say,
Right.
well, yeah, you didn't have the life that
I couldn't say it, right.
yeah.
One of her most famous works is A Bunny's Tale, which was published in 1962, that detailed how women were treated in the Playboy bunny clubs in New York. She went undercover as a Playboy bunny named Marie and just experienced what these women were going through. A quote from that article is, A group of men with name tags on their lapels stood nearby. "Here's my bunny honey now," one said, flung his arm around my shoulders as if we were fellow halfbacks leaving the field. This work helped put Gloria Steinem on the map because it was this kind of investigative journalism that was interesting enough to get attention, but brought forward the feminist ideas that she wanted to convey. Gloria Steinem has met several controversies and several criticisms along her career. I mean, who hasn't? One of the biggest ones were her book Revolution from Within, a book about self-esteem, was criticized for not being about social justice as she had advertised it, but instead just focusing on herself and about her own struggles. And her response to this was, "We need to be long distance runners to make a real social revolution. And you can't be a long distance runner unless you have some inner strength." And that was her justification for the book being more about her own self esteem as to giving women self esteem for themselves.
Gloria Steinem started her life already on the road. As a child, every year her father would move the family to try and find work. This is what started her life of traveling. The travels and adventures that began in her childhood are still going strong today. She was heavily influenced by both of her parents. Her father instilled in her the love of the road and meeting people. It was because of him that she began her life on the road, never driving a car alone, but always trying to meet new faces and find new experiences. Her mother's influence was much different. Because her father never worried, Steinem says that it made her mother worry enough for both of them. She also says that her mother gave up on many of her own dreams when she married her father. Yet at least my father had been able to choose his own journey. He never realized his dreams, but my mother was unable to even pursue hers. Mourning for the independent life her mother never had was one of the key influences that shaped Steinem's feminist ideology. As mentioned before, both of her parents were central figures in shaping Steinem's life and travels. Her love for her mother and empathy for women everywhere shaped the ideas that she shared to those who would listen along her travels. Travels which would not have been possible without the experiences she had with her father. The first of those travels, which she describes to us, is her trip to India. In the years after college, my father's influence became even clearer in the choices I made. For instance, to go to India instead of seeking a regular job. While living in India for 2 years, she makes one of the most important decisions of her life. She is not going to travel by simply driving alone. She says, "In a car by myself, I wouldn't really be in India." Opting out of the car, she instead takes a woman-only train car. The myriad of different stories and identities she meets on the journey live on in her memory for decades. Returning from India, Steinem soon found her calling in America. In the midst of Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Malcolm X's fight for black equality, Gloria Steinem found a voice for female equality as well. If I had to name the most important discovery of my life, it would be the portable community of talking circles, groups that gather with all five senses and allow consciousness to change. This discovery of her love for organized discussion is what begins the next segment of her memoir, chronicling the various different town hall meetings and campus talks through which she was able to spread her ideas, all while continuing to travel along the road she loved so much. She spends a great deal of time helping to organize political conferences and rallies, but her true love is speaking on campus. How do I love campuses? Let me count the ways. Her experiences on these campuses cement her as a visible political figure in the fight for equality. Decades after that first trip to India, after countless campus sit-ins, town hall meetings, political rallies, and taxi rides, she finally settles down. Hesitant at first to finally have a place she can call home, she eventually sees it as a sort of freedom. It doesn't mean she has to stop traveling, only that she will have a place to return to when she is done. Gloria Steinem's travels and adventures contain enough events for 10 lifetimes. However, even after all these years, she remains as a visible figure in the fight for equality. Her relentless pursuit for justice for women has put her in the forefront of that movement, and her experience and expertise make her an invaluable asset for feminists everywhere.
One of the more prevalent themes in Gloria Steinem's My Life on the Road is that of communication. Throughout the book, she emphasizes the importance of talking circles, wherein each member of the group gets equal say in the discussion. This is illustrated through the business concept of a holacracy, which I've included a picture of in contrast to the more traditional business model of a hierarchy. As you can see, this is a much more inclusive system. It's a system that Steinem uses in her role as organizer for these civil rights events and campaigns splayed across the country. Not only does this allow more people to become involved in these events, but it sets an example for other organizers. Basically, instead of talking about inclusivity, she brings in diverse women to speak on their own issues, issues she may not have even known about had she not spoken with them first. Although communication is only partly about speaking, it is also about listening and putting yourself in a situation to listen. Steinem has accomplished this through her travels. In fact, much of her book is filled with stories of taxi drivers or fellow passengers on the bus. There is rarely, if ever, a Kerouac-esque meditation on the road itself, or any professions to enjoy traveling in solitude. Conversely, Steinem notes the disconnectedness and isolation that comes from privacy. This is especially in reference to the upper echelons that can afford their own jets and limousines, a power that makes them unable to relate effectively to those who can't afford such things, also shining a light on how divisions between social classes impedes communication.
No matter where Steinem went, communicating with and getting to know new people was always on her agenda. Through branching out and interacting with all the different people she met, Gloria Steinem was able to inspire. Whether it was on the train car in India or at the dozens of college campuses she spoke at, her infectious ideology was always spread. Her presence was described by one of the students she worked with as shock therapy that began a year of organizing. In talking about things that weren't always openly discussed, she opened the door for not just feminists, but for anyone who felt discriminated against. As much as she inspired others with her own story, she was equally affected by the stories which were shared with her. No matter where she went, she was always trying to hear a new story or meet a new face. Even something as mundane as riding in a taxi was almost wholly experience for her. Altogether, getting to know the human being inside the driver is an adventure too. Her openness to hear from new people was something truly special about the way she traveled. Learning from so many different walks of life gave her a truly unique perspective of the world.